In this video, I will be talking about the influence of Dungeons & Dragons on fantasy fiction. There's quite a lot of discussion that you can find online and elsewhere about the other way around, the influence of fantasy fiction on Dungeons & Dragons. But I haven't found really anything about the influences of Dungeons & Dragons. The consensus seems to be that there hasn't been any. And I believe that this is wrong. If you think about it, it's quite likely that a lot of fantasy authors played Dungeons & Dragons. They may have got their start in, if not their start in inventing things, certainly their start in inventing things in the fantasy genre in Dungeons & Dragons. And it would be odd if that didn't have any effect. And I've found four major features of fantasy post-Dungeons & Dragons, which is to say after roughly 1974, when the very first edition of Dungeons & Dragons was released, that aren't found in fantasy very often before 1974 and can be easily explained as being a reflection of how Dungeons & Dragons works. So I want to go through those four very briefly. The first one is what I would call systemic magic or magic systems. And what I mean by that is that magic in post-D&D fantasy tends towards magic systems which are widely understood in the world of the story, which the reader is intended to understand the limits of, and which have sort of set limits, and often those limits are an influence on the plot. That is, you start by being told these are the rules of magic and this is how magic works, and then the plot might be, oh, but we have found that there's this other sort of magic that doesn't seem to conform to that structure, or there's this person who seems to be able to do something that doesn't conform to the structure, or what are the implications of that structure. A really good example is Brandon Sanderson. He has quite a lot of books in which there's a magic system based on different metals, and the nature of that magic system is a real driver of the plot. The second factor is what I would call multicultural settlements. What I mean by that is that you have cities or other settlements in which different species are living together in a way that is analogous to the way that different ethnic groups live together in a modern Western city. So in Terry Pratchett, for example, you have Ankh-Morpork, and trolls and dwarves and humans live there, as well as various vampires and golems and things live there as well. And it's sometimes hostile, and there are sort of neighbourhoods where particular species, or they're often called races, predominate, but you don't find sort of universal hostility. You don't find that no dwarf may live where trolls live, or no human may live where elves live or something. And I think this concept is probably based on the typical Dungeons & Dragons party, in which you probably will have 2 or 3 different races represented at the very least. And those parties, in turn, are based on the Fellowship in the Fellowship of the Ring. But that's not how settlements work in Lord of the Rings, or indeed in The Hobbit before that. You have the Shire, and that's where the hobbits live. You have the dwarves live over here, the elves live over here, the humans live over here. Everyone's quite suspicious of each other. There's an incident in Lord of the Rings where one of the Rohirrim is surprised to learn that hobbits exist. He seems to have thought that they were creatures of myth, that if they ever existed, perhaps they went extinct long ago. The third element is polytheism in settings whose real-world equivalents were monotheist. The original version of Dungeons & Dragons is pretty much intended to evoke medieval Europe. Plate mail is the best armour. Crossbows are the most advanced weapon technology. There are castles. The horse seems to be the standard mode of transport other than walking, and so on. And yet the implication is clearly that there's polytheism. You're meant to pick a god for your clerics at least. And of course, real medieval Europe, at least the bit with crossbows and plate mail, was very thoroughly monotheist, and in fact the church was a very important entity, possibly the most important entity. And the final element is worlds whose relation to the real world is not stated. Middle-earth, for example, is specifically stated to be the Earth in the distant past. Robert E. Howard's Conan is specifically set in the Earth in the distant past. There are others that are set in the future, an alternate history, another planet, and so on. But in Dungeons and Dragons, there's never any statement as to where this is meant to be in relation to the real world. I think you're meant to make it up, but people largely didn't. And so Dungeons and Dragons developed this habit of having quite detailed worlds and descriptions of worlds, never explaining where the real world fit into that cosmology. In fact, there was a setting called Planescape, which was intended to link existing D&D settings and explain that they all existed in this multiverse, and and to explain how you could travel between them, etc. But still, the real world never featured as one of the parts of the multiverse. And you do see this in post D&D fantasy as well. Westeros, for example, in A Game of Thrones, yes, it's obviously based on the Wars of the Roses. The geography, it looks quite a bit like Britain and Ireland in a slightly different orientation, but it's never stated this is an alternate history of England or anything else. You're just intended to not ask that question, and people don't, because that's now the sort of standard fantasy trope. Whereas in, for example, Narnia is specifically connected to the real world. You can get into Narnia via particular portals, and in fact, that's a big part of the plot is getting into Narnia and back, and the relationship between things that happen in Narnia and the real world, and in particular Christianity, which C.S. Lewis took as being sort of the truth of the real world. So just to briefly summarise, I believe, apparently I'm in a minority of one on this, but it does seem to me that D&D, or Dungeons and Dragons, has had quite an influence on modern fantasy, and in particular I would cite systemic, rule-based, widely explained magic, what I might call multicultural settlements, polytheism in settings whose real-world equivalents were monotheist, and worlds whose connection to the real world is never stated.